I'm Jake.
I'm Tom.
We are Velocities in Music. On this podcast, Tom and I discuss a handful of topics pertaining to modern music, including artist deep dives and monthly and annual new music wrap-ups. Tom.
Yes.
Speaking of artist deep dives.
That's what we're doing.
We're doing one today, buddy.
All right.
One of our favorite artists, collectively.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Collectively. Ween.
Yes.
Now, we had the pleasure of seeing Ween in concert up in St. Paul at Roy Wilkins Auditorium last week, almost a week ago.
Yep.
And these guys put on one hell of a show. It was
great.
It was 2.5 hours. They played, how many songs did they play?
30?
30 songs. Yeah. One of which had only been played 5 times before.
Yeah.
We'll get to that, obviously, as we go through the albums. If you've listened to an artist deep dive before, what Tom and I do in an artist deep dive, we give you guys a little bit of personality about how Tom and I got into the band, so in this case, Ween, how we got into Ween, and then we'll go into a little bit of backstory about Ween. Now, I got to be honest, I don't think there is this like super deep backstory to this band, as there have been with other deep dives that we've done, you know?
Yeah, I agree with that.
Ween's pretty straightforward when it comes to that aspect, but then we'll jump to, I mean, these guys have technically have 9 studio release albums, and we'll go through all of those for you and then talk about the impacts of Ween on music and their cult following that they've been able to accumulate over the years. So, without further ado, it's time to deep dive into the great Ween.
Let's do it.
So, Tom, start us off with just your personal relationship to this band. How did you get into Ween?
So I got into Ween probably 2005, early 2006-ish, when really it was our friend Brandon who got the album Pure Guava and brought it over to my place.
Pure Guava was your entry point.
And I hated it. I thought it was garbage.
I could totally see that.
I was like, what the hell is this? How do they call this music? You know, that kind of stuff. I had a lot of growing up to do, you know, let's admit it. But
you were really into the butt rock back then.
I liked a lot of indie stuff too, but Ween was out there.
Yeah.
Ween was
that was a little too out there at that point.
So I got, as I still do, and I did this 10 or 11 years ago, I still do today, I immediately got on AllMusic and looked them up because I wanted to get a comprehensive quick look at their discography, how many albums they had, what the general rating was of them. And I saw that Pure Guava had 5 out of 5 stars on AllMusic. And I was like, what planet am I living on? There's a glitch in the Matrix. This does not compute. There's no way that this album is that highly regarded. So I started listening to some of their other stuff. I had some friends recommend other albums of theirs to me. I checked out Chocolate and Cheese and the Mollusk.
Wait, are you saying they don't all sound like Pure Guava?
Right.
Okay.
Then that's the magic of Ween, is that none of their stuff really sounds alike, which I love. But I ended up loving those albums, the Mollusk and Chocolate and Cheese. And over time, Pure Guava grew on me as well. But in July 2006, I got to see Ween perform in Des Moines, Iowa here. And I was blown away by the show. It was a terrific show. And after that, I was much more sold. You know, they played a lot of stuff from their whole discography all over the place. And so then it gave me a better entry point because I felt like I could relate it back to how they performed live. Because on their albums, you know, you have a variety of production styles from the early minimalist, really murky 4-track days to the later, more polished kind of genre-hopping days, and even some serious, more soulful songs, and really, you know, they've got some love ballads, they've got some more serious stuff.
Could you put their music into like genre categories or a genre category?
I think it's tough because they hop around so much.
Yeah, I think they're loosely considered as an alternative rock band, but what does that mean?
Right. Anymore, I mean, that's just where you put the leftovers that you can't define. And I think they are one of the hardest bands to define.
They really
overall.
are. But I do think that the alternative, like not in the sense of like this is just the hodgepodge of like what their sound is. The alternative of kicking against the system. Like these guys come from punk roots, you know.
Yeah.
You know, Dean and Gene have a little bit of that like punk influence, and they have a little bit of that like 80s kind of dancey influence, I think, in there. And you know, as these guys, you know, if you want to just jump into some history here,
sure,
Tom. You know, like these guys formed in high school, so like they wore their influences on their sleeves, and they were really in this like rebellious period.
Right. They spent the 80s just making like kind of bedroom demos together. The two two guys. This is a duo. I don't think we mentioned Dean and Jean Ween. Real names Mickey Melchiondo, not quite sure how to pronounce that, and Aaron Freeman are Dean and Jean, respectively. And yeah, they were just high school friends who in their teenagers started making these kind of goofy, fun songs. And they released a bunch of just kind of homemade cassettes and things throughout the 80s, which somehow landed them on a, kind of indie deal with Twin Tone Records for them to release their debut, which we'll get into in a bit. But they're from New Hope, Pennsylvania, and this is just kind of what they did to stay sane and keep their lives interesting, is write these fun songs. And they all come together to make something really interesting. And when you look at how they started, it's about as organic and about as pure as you can get. Just a couple of friends messing around with audio equipment, but still, I think that what people will overlook if they hyper focus on the silliness that tends to exist in some of Ween's music is really the brilliant musicianship that's driving it. These guys are good at their instruments. They're good songwriters. They're good with melody. One thing that I think is really overlooked is even from the beginning, Aaron Freeman, Gene Ween, is a tremendous vocalist.
Yeah, actually.
Very diverse.
Very, very diverse, very dynamic.
Yeah.
And so many times, like listening through Ween's discography, I've honestly thought over the years before I did a bunch of research into Ween, like these guys, I always thought that they had multiple vocalists singing. It's pretty much
mostly Gene.
It's mostly Gene.
Dean does on some tracks.
Yes.
And they have a lot of like dual vocals.
Yes.
They'll kind of trade off, or Dean will do backup. Or they'll kind of trade off on some of the more conversational, funny tracks, like you get with Blackjack and I Play It Off Legit, stuff like that, where it's kind of multiple personas in the song. But it's primarily Gene, and he has a tremendously unique voice, and he uses it really well. Actually, if we're not going to get too much into their live albums. They have several live albums, but one in particular, Live at the Cat's Cradle in 1992, which came out just shortly, or it was the concert was performed shortly after Pure Guava was released. I mean, that was in 1992. These guys were like 22 years old. Their debut came out in 1990 when they were like 20. And then a couple of years later, and you listen to these live performances, and it's like, shit, this guy is just a good rock vocalist. He uses it to make some bizarre stuff, but the talent is there, and it takes a lot of talent to be able to mold your voice in all those different ways.
Well, and Mickey absolutely shreds it on guitar.
Oh, he does.
He is an incredible guitarist. And I always knew that before. A lot of Ween tracks throughout their discography, early years, middle years, late years, have just wonderful guitar solos peppered in throughout the songs. Not in a very straightforward sort of verse chorus. We're gonna have this big solo bridge. Like sometimes they have a simpler structure like that, but just the way that these guys can craft songs, and usually the guitar solo is one of the highlights of each track, and they're so coy with how they just sneak it in there. It always seems to sneak up on you, and it becomes kind of the focal point of the track, to me anyways.
And it is always tactful, because that he could just shred,
right?
But they always, it never feels like the focus. It never feels masturbatorial or self-serving. It always feels tactful. Now, there's something we got to address before we dive into their actual discography, and that's just the general humor and persona of the band. Something I want to address is, I think that sometimes people, when they don't really understand or wrap their head around Ween as a band, they tend to get incorrectly labeled as a joke band. I would disagree with that.
Now some of their music is very humorous.
Oh, absolutely. It's very humorous. But where I think of and this is all just arguments of definition, right? People will have different definitions for this. But when I think of joke band, I think of bands like parody bands,
even
or
Tenacious D.
Yeah, Tenacious D, Flight of the Conchords.
Right.
You got like Weird Al as a parody artist. And I love all those groups. That's why I bring them up, because I'm not trying to say there's anything wrong with that label inherently, but I think it needs to be used correctly. And the thing about those artists is, like, think Tenacious D, think like the song Tribute, or think Flight of the Conchords. They got the song Prettiest Girl in the Room, depending on the room. Like, you can pick those out, and you can explain what the joke is behind that song.
Right.
You can explain the concept of the song. You can explain, why it's funny. There's that logic behind it. There's a punchline. There's something to explain. You don't really get that with Ween. If you listen to tracks like, I'll just throw out a few: Right to the Ways and the Rules of the World, Big Jim, If you listen to Mr. Would You Please Help My Pony, these songs are sometimes...
I play it off legit.
I play it off legit. There's sometimes silly, there's sometimes inane, bizarre.
Sometimes these guys actually break down in laughter.
Yeah.
As they're delivering the vocals,
Right.
and they left it in the master track, which I think is pretty ballsy, honestly,
Right.
to leave like the fact that they just kind of broke down in laughter over what they were
Right.
doing, because it's so absurd sometimes.
It is.
Yet it adds this form of levity. And it's kind of refreshing to hear an artist not take themselves that seriously,
Right.
yet their music still has, so many layers to it,
Right.
that it's still interesting. It's still good music.
Yep, and I think it takes understanding that and shedding any expectation of there being some kind of punchline or focal concept to their songs to really like them, because, I mentioned I found them very challenging at first, and I think it's because I was looking for some kind of deeper meaning behind the madness, and it doesn't have to be. The beauty of them is that they just are what they are, and their songs exist just on this whole different plane.
And Tom, that is a great segue to my story of how I got into Ween.
All right.
So you had been into Ween for a few years, and
Okay.
and your brothers and my friends had all been listening to Ween. Our little circle group of friends in college, we're listening to Ween, and there was some Ween that I listened to and I liked. But I never really grasped what that band was, for exactly the reasons that Tom was just describing. I was looking for some deeper meaning to what Ween is, what they were trying to do. I wanted to know what it was all about, like what the meaning of life sort of thing.
Yeah.
And like I was so frustrated because I could tell that these guys were doing some really cool things. I could hear the good song, and I could hear the great instrumentation, but I couldn't put it all together. Like the dots wouldn't connect. And then one day, I remember the album Chocolate and Cheese, which we'll talk about here in a bit, but I remember the song Spinal Meningitis, and how weird I thought that song was. Well, one night, I was living with a roommate of ours, or a friend of ours who was my roommate at the time, and I had this just crazy dream where I walked upstairs, and he was blaring the song my roommate was blaring this song Spinal Meningitis. He was laying on the floor. He looked stoned out of his mind, just completely just drunk or stoned or some obliviated state, and just laying on the floor with his head up against the wall, just going, "It's so deep, man. It's so deep." And from that moment on, like that dream is hilarious, just the image of that dream. And I realized that taking Ween seriously is the joke.
Right.
That is the joke. It's not serious, but yet somehow it mirrors life.
Yeah.
And it's supposed to be laughed at. It's the situation of Ween is funny,
Right.
and that's what makes their music accessible.
I compare it to, Jake, you and I are big fans of Tim and Eric Awesome Show, Great Job.
Exactly.
And I think it's a similar kind of mindset. So I've got, quick story for everyone. I've got 3 older brothers, John, Pat, and Dan. Jake, obviously you know them very well. Three of us, me, Pat, and Dan, love Tim and Eric. We also love Ween. The one that doesn't is John. He hates Tim and Eric Awesome Show. He hates Ween.
Yeah.
I think that I'm not going to say that correlation exists for everyone, but I think it's a similar kind of humor.
Well, I think it's a good direction to postulate, because I do think that if you are looking for deeper meaning in life, and therefore looking for deeper meaning in the entertainment you seek, whether that be something, like a TV show or a movie or music, what Ween is trying to bring to the table isn't there, or at least on the surface, it isn't there. Now, I actually think that when you get into some of Ween's later albums, and we'll get to some of this later as we go through each album, there actually is a lot of depth there that you could pick apart and actually understand. Like, there's some deeper meaning to these songs, to some of these songs. Now, early days, it's certainly not that.
Yeah,
I wouldn't go that far, and I think that we should start by jumping into their first record.
Yeah,
GodWeSatan, the Oneness.
So we're going to start with 1990, GodWeSatan, the Oneness, Ween's debut album. And this album, keep in mind, these guys are fresh out of their teenage years. They've somehow managed to kind of start a budding career as musicians for themselves, and they release this 26-track monolith of a debut. It's a long album. It's over 70 minutes long. In the re-release that came out about 11 years later, they added 3 extra tracks to it, so 29 tracks. And a lot of the tracks are like between a minute and a half to 2 minutes long. There are 2, I want to point out 2 key tracks on here, Nicole and Let Me Lick Your Pussy, the latter being kind of a Prince riff, if you will. That those two tracks are like 9.5 minutes long and then almost 9 minutes long. So those two tracks on their own take up like 25% of the runtime of this album. But this just goes all over the place. Now, it feels a lot like a compilation. That's kind of because it is. A lot of these tracks had been worked on previously and maybe released on different tapes that they had made throughout the 80s and so on. But what you have here, and this is something that's really characteristic of a lot of Ween's music, is it feels like you're just witness to a bunch of inside jokes of these two guys that you don't really get.
Yes. A bunch of like debauchery and almost like roughhousing with musical instruments. Like it was pretty clear that these guys were not, in the in crowd, right? They wanted to be kicking against the system, being in that alternative scene. And they captured that with just the essence of how loosely recorded this is, of just some of the lyrical content that they use, the premises of some of these very short tracks. Like when you look at track 3, I'm in the mood to move,
which is one of my favorite tracks.
It's one of the best tracks.
It's only
on this
like
record.
a minute long. So I showed this to my brother John, who I mentioned hated Ween. And right after the first line of the song, which is just, I'm in the mood to move to the left 3 feet, god damn it.
I'm in the mood to move to the left 3 feet, god damn it. I'm in the mood to slide to the right 100 feet, god damn it.
I showed that to my brother, and he's like, is that a reference to something? Is that from something? And I'm like, God damn it, no, it's not.
It doesn't need to be.
Which is exactly the attitude that will make you not like Ween. You can't be looking for references to it just is what it is, and it's funny.
Right.
And there's a lot of that on this album. There's no context. They don't set you up with the background of what these jokes are. You get to one of my favorite tracks, maybe because it sounds more like something from Pure Guava, but near the end you get Blackjack.
Blackjack, big black Betty, flapjack on big black Betty, slap Betty, flap Eddie, Jack, splat, back, splat,
which is just nonsense. It's a nonsense track, but it cracks me up every single time.
And it's very clear that, to me anyways, it sounds drug infused. They're clearly under the influence of several different layers of drugs and other amphetamines and things like that as they write these songs that just sound like they're from like another planet. They're using all sorts of modulated sounding
vocal effects
and everything just sounds muddy and dirty, but yet it provides this like otherworldly sort of cryptic atmosphere, that they're constantly just delivering these just obscure kind of juvenile lyrics from that are funny when you kind of just listen to them for what they are. It's like how absurd. Absurd is kind of a good word for this album. It's just a collection of absurdities. It's like they were trying to just be the biggest obnoxious pains in the asses that they could when it came to music, and then they put that in this huge compilation record of all of their stuff that they had written up to this point. There's several tracks on here though that like when I listen to, I just think that are fantastic, and totally fun to listen to. I really do enjoy this record. I find it to be very fun to listen to. Tracks like Tick, track 2, I'm in the mood to move, track 3, which we mentioned, Fat Lenny. They played that live.
Yeah.
Clear highlight there.
Fat Lenny's gonna walk right into myself. Fat Lenny's gonna see myself reflected back on myself. And Fat Lenny's gonna lick the slack off the windowsill. And I said, Fat Lenny's gonna lick my head off.
Later on in the albums, you have tracks like Nicole. There's even a little bit of a deeper track, Birthday Boy.
That's a great one.
Yeah, Birthday Boy's a little bit deeper, but again, there's no percussion in that track. It's just kind of this like washy wall of sound. But if you actually listen to it, you can tell that there's something deeper going on.
The melody
there.
is great. The chord progression is great. Like from a writing standpoint, it's a very mature song.
And even the lyrics are much more mature than anything else that you hear on the album. You can kind of see that there's something going on here, that these guys clearly have talent, that they're choosing to be the obnoxious, debaucherous little boys that they were being on this record, but like there's something deeper here and there's talent.
And there's still a lot of genre hopping here. They're experimenting with genres like they were probably experimenting with drugs at the time. Right. Let's face it. They're just kind of like, hey, let's dabble in this. Let's do this. But the amazing thing is they're talented enough to pull it off. You got tracks like Up on the Hill, which is kind of like a soulful gospel thing. You got Nicole, which is kind of this funky psychedelic dub type track. El Camino has some kind of Spanish and Latin vibes to it. I mean, they really go everywhere with this. Squelch the Weasel has this great kind of psychedelic guitar solo at the end that just shows off how freaking talented they are instrumentally. And so because of that, the whole thing feels like kind of a power play. Mm-hmm. At such a young age, they're like, yeah, we could do anything we fucking want. We're just going to make some fun tracks. And if you get it, you get it. And if you don't, we don't care because we're making this for ourselves. It's a really interesting attitude.
So quick criticism. This album is way too long.
Oh, yeah.
Considering what the quality of the music that's here. There is just clearly some songs that just aren't as good as others that they could have dropped from this. But at the same time, I feel like that would take away from some of the novelty of the sound.
Yeah.
So it's kind of tough for me to make that argument because I enjoy GodWeSatan, the Oneness for what it is. And I feel like if they tried to perfect it, it would take away from that just chaotic sprawl feel that it has. So it's kind of a loaded criticism to say that, but that is the reason why this probably isn't one of my favorite Ween albums.
Same here, but I think all the tracks, even the ones that aren't the best on the album, even some that maybe could have been cut, they provide that launching point for the rest of their career. They're establishing a broad foundation that shows we can do anything, and that's what to expect. And so they move on from there.
GodWeSatan, the Oneness came out in 1990. A year later, Ween released their second record in 1991 called The Pod. Now, The Pod is kind of the next logical step for Ween. These two guys, these two just angsty kids making crazy music. And in 1990, they started just doing more recording. They kind of locked themselves in a house. They ended up getting mono during this. In fact, there was a track called Mononucleosis on this record. Even everything about this record just seems a little bit more claustrophobic.
Yeah.
And Tom will definitely dive into why the sound is so much. I guess I would say it sounds a little bit more. It's a step towards a mature sound. A more mature sound, but there's reasons as to why, because I think they actually took a step back with the production.
Yeah, and this is, to me, their most like demented, bizarre, and probably inaccessible album.
I would agree with that.
They're taking a step forward in terms of how they're writing and how they're working together.
Obviously, because the track lengths are double that,
right,
on average, of what GodWeSatan was.
They're making more what you would call full songs rather than maybe these kinds of sketches,
just
or
like sketch ideas, right?
Right. But this album, you know, they were recorded this and Pure Guava, which would come out the next year, on a 4-track. So it's pretty rudimentary recording stuff back in the early 90s. And it's funny moving from GodWeSatan to The Pod, because The Pod actually feels like a step backward in production style. You know, the drum machines are less forgiving and less trying to sound like real drums. The guitars, while you can still see there's a lot of talent in the guitar work.
I like that, Gatalent.
Gatalent.
We need to get that. That's really good.
Gatallica, is that a band?
It's gonna be.
But they really go off the deep end just in terms of content too. You know, I mentioned that it feels like you're just listening into these inside jokes that they have. And here you've got 4 different tracks that reference pork roll, egg, and cheese, for example. And the first one is not the track called Pork Roll, Egg, and Cheese. That comes later in the album. And so you know this has got to just be some kind of joke to them, and you're not really privy to it, but you're along for the ride anyway. But here, just the sound is very murky. There's still some genre hopping, but the production isn't really clear enough to make it understandable what genre they're going for all the time, which is actually a fact that I think works in this album's favor, because I think that the production value creates consistency. So even while they're just going nuts, while they're, jumping from these kind of like soft, slow tracks to then like metal tracks like Sketches of Winkle, which is a highlight to me, feels like kind of a hard rock or metal song. the production actually really ties it all together, and that's what allows them to do that. But this is a beast of an album. It's got 23 tracks. It's another really long album, but there's just an allure to this album.
Yes.
There's this mysticism to it that just pulls you back, and I find myself wanting to listen to it almost more than I even like it. Like it's I don't know, maybe like my number 5, number 6-ish favorite Ween album, which I love all of Ween's stuff. So, that's up there. But I find myself coming back to this even more than some of the albums that are higher up, just because there are key tracks on here that I just cannot get enough of.
It's kind of crazy how these early Ween records, which are so inaccessible, have such a good straight through album play.
Mm-hmm.
This album suffers from similar, problems that I would say GodWeSatan suffered from, in that it's a very long album. That some tracks are clearly stronger than others.
Yeah.
Probably some tracks that arguably you could have cut, but why would you? Because the experience is supposed to be this eclectic ride.
Yeah.
And the fact that they kind of, at least on what seems like some sort of like production sheen or production strategy, or maybe lack thereof, to this whole album, it does have this thematic quality to it. And I would agree with you, Tom, like of any of the Ween records, especially of the first half of their discography, this is the one I find myself wanting to come back to more so now. Now, that's not really fair. I've been listening to Pure Guava on repeat for years.
Yeah.
Whereas the Pod, I'm much, it's a much newer experience for me. I've only listened to this record probably more than 5 times, right?
Yeah.
And really a lot of it was in preparation for the concert in here, because it just has been so accessible. Now, I find that this record has been very rewarding, just because, just like on GodWeSatan, there is a number of tracks on here that I think are just fantastic. And more importantly, I think this album really opens well. You have Strap On That Jimmy Pack, which is kind of this druggy, just slurred speech opener. Dr. Rock, which is a very distorted, almost to the point that it's hard to understand what's going on. But it's a full out rock track, and I really think you get to hear like Aaron's really good rock vocals come out on that track. Frank's a great track, and then track 6, Tom, is where you start to see them get a little bit more playful with a track with a kind of a joke track called Pollo Asado. This song they actually played live. I think we were lucky enough to be like the 6th.
Yeah, they haven't played it much. Yeah,
live
in the history of their band.
But I think Tenacious D has got to take influence from Ween. They totally do, because when Tenacious D did their drive-through food ordering sketch, like this is essentially that. It's a food ordering sketch of 2 and almost 3 minutes.
That makes no sense. The person is ordering an insane amount of food. The change that is given does not add up. And so it's just
that's actually my favorite part, when the change doesn't.
1607 is your change.
It's clearly not
right
what the change is supposed to be.
Like a large iced tea, 2 large iced teas. Okay, that'll be 1607. 20. Okay. This is 1607's your change.
But where Ween throughout their entire career are trying to push your limits in terms of content, this is the album where they're most trying to push you in terms of presentation. You have songs like Molly and Laura, which are 2 of my favorite tracks, but on first listen, they're probably going to irritate you.
Right.
They are trying to be abrasive. They are trying to be unlistenable to the casual listener, but then once you get past that same quality is what makes you fall in love with it. There are a lot of tracks like that on here. I think my favorite track on this album is track 8, Captain Fantasy. That song just sticks with me. Great melody, great just swirling guitar progression. I find that the songs that are a little bit weaker to me are some of the just really sedated, quiet, drug-fueled tracks, stuff like Demon Sweat, Alone, Moving Away, Boing. I don't know if I necessarily remove them though, because they don't really step on each other.
Sure.
But I don't really find myself wanting to come back to this album for those tracks. I just listen through them anyway.
Now, in the album notes, Ween apparently said at one point in time that they were on the heavily influenced by Scotch Guard. Now, they've since come back and said that was all kind of a ruse, just to I don't know, just to be out there, try to be as obnoxious as possible. But it certainly feels like they were on some sort of crazy drug, because this is just not the normal sort of music that you hear somebody write. Like, and for that I have to give them credit. They're really trying to do something original here, that not every artist is willing to do, that has the balls to do something like that.
All right, now we move into late 1992 with Pure Guava. This album is actually it was recorded, through the same kind of process as the pod was, kind of a compilation of a couple of tapes.
It's actually their major label.
It is their major label debut.
Which doesn't make any
Elektra.
sense.
It doesn't make any sense. Because there's nothing radio friendly or commercial about this album. Now, they did have kind of a one-off cult radio hit with Push the Little Daisies.
Yeah, got famous for Beavis and
Butthead,
right?
Making fun of it.
Which actually, if you think about it, Beavis and Butthead and Ween,
it's like they go hand in hand, man.
They really do.
Yeah.
Similar to Tim and Eric. Like,
Right.
Beavis and Butthead's a very obnoxious, kind of juvenile teenage alternative TV show, and Ween is the music that goes with that.
Girl, it's true. The whole wide world is smiling with you. Push the little daisies and make them come up. Push the little daisies and make them come up. Push the little daisies and make them come up.
So Pure Guava is my favorite Ween album. I'll come out and say that right away to get any bias in the open. I cannot get enough of this album, and stylistically, it is challenging. It's a weird album. It's bizarre. The thing that I love about it, and in context of coming off of the pod the year before, I think that actually stylistically, this represents one of the smallest changes that we'll see in their discography between the pod and Pure Guava. I think because they were recorded so close in time and similar environment, they sound somewhat similar. Where I think the big difference comes in is that kind of murky quality that the pod had, it's still a little bit here, but I find Pure Guava to be a lot more aggressive in sound, and a big part of that is the rhythms, the beats. The drum machines are far more aggressive here. You do have a couple of kind of slow tracks with like Sarah and Loving You Through It All. But there's not as much of a guitar focus on this album. To me, it's all about the beats. Listen to tracks like Going Gets Tough from the Get-Go, Reggae Junkie Jew, Pumpin' for the Man, Spring Theme. These tracks to me are all about the percussion, all about these constructed beats that they've put together, and they're much more compressed, they're much more in your face, and that's what anchors the album for me.
In addition to that, I mean, you're seeing them expand their songwriting, and it kind of shows. This is what I kind of mean when I've been saying, there's something deeper going on here with Ween. Yes, it sounds obnoxious. Yes, it seems very superficial. But when you actually listen and try to pick this apart, and then listen to their discography, and kind of apply that critical mindset to it, you can see them growing as songwriters. As Tom was mentioning, the different songwriting focuses on the beats on this record, but also you hear, like, vocally, these guys are doing more with harmonies. They are writing much catchier vocal parts, songs built around a certain vocal melody or vocal idea, even a super distorted or modulated vocal melody might become the focal point of the certain track. Whereas before it was probably just vocals and the lyrical content that you were supposed to pay attention to. Now here, they're trying to be just as obnoxious, and to the point that I find it to be just freaking hilarious.
Yeah.
And on almost every track, I end up laughing at some point just because of how absurd they're trying to make it sound and how uncomfortable it makes me feel. And just the fact that they're able to do that is incredible. You have to give them credit for that, and part of it is just the crazy things they're doing with the vocals, some of the absurd lyrics, just the difference in the grating sounds that they're trying to make.
But the thing that makes Ween different and so special is that you don't come back to them just for the humor.
Right.
They're not like a band that you just go, oh, you're hanging out with your friend, and I got to show you this funny song. It's not like that. It's I put this album on all the time because I just need to listen to it. And where I think that this album improves a lot on the previous two as well is, it's 19 tracks. Still fairly long.
It's a little shorter,
a little bit shorter,
a little bit more focused,
but more just to me. Every single track on here is good. I always look forward to the next track whenever it's ready to come, and I'm laughing all over again. And all of these tracks get stuck in my head. I just can't get enough of it. What we also see, and we saw this on the pod too, but I think even more so on Pure Guava, that I think is so strange and why GodWeSatan is such a weird debut, is GodWeSatan is very much a guitar album. It is a hard rockin' album. There are tracks that are punk, hard rock. You got some psychedelic guitar solos. You don't get them being as showy on the pod or Pure Guava. The guitar is almost dumbed down and played like oddly on purpose. Like you listen to that solo riff in Flies on My Dick, which is one of my favorite Ween songs, and it's like, oh my God, why would you play it that way? When you've listened to their debut and you know that they can play cleaner than that, but it's all by design. It's all on purpose, and I can't imagine that any other way. It's one of my favorite guitar solos.
Just a boy with a gypsy nun. I love it when you stick me with your stuff.
There's several examples of that all over this record. I Saw Jeaner Crying in His Sleep. Definitely has, the guitar just sounds sloppy. It sounds out of tune. It's just crazy all over the place. Also, the song Loving You Through It All. I mean, he's just missing notes here.
Yeah.
Either they recorded that completely drug influenced and to the point where they couldn't keep up with the vocals. They were forgetting lyrics. They were missing the part, and they just kept it. And which it just kind of works because it's such a serious song juxtaposed with just the sloppiness of its presentation to the point that it's funny. It just has this magical quality to it.
You actually just brought something up that I think is another reason I love this album that I hadn't considered, and that's that I think this album is the pinnacle throughout their discography of utilizing the double-tracked vocals and that conversational element between Gene and Dean as simultaneous vocalists. You get that on Big Jim. You get that on The Going Gets Tough from the Get-Go. I Play It Off Legit, Loving You Through It All, where there's these doubled vocal tracks that the way they converse with each other, or the way they don't quite line up or aren't quite on time and in sync with each other, is what makes some of the humor. We saw it on Blackjack from their debut, and here they're really capitalizing on it.
Right, dude? That's right. The going gets tough from the get-go. Go, man, go. Oh, brother, not another motherfucker gonna go now. Isn't that right, dude? That's right, Gina. So right. The going gets tough from the get-go. Go, man, go. Oh, brother, not another motherfucker gonna go now.
I think that all the things that all the ideas that they presented in GodWeSatan and some of the production strides that they made in songwriting strides that they made on the pod, I think all of that early Ween sound is perfected on Pure Guava. I think this is really where they start tying the bow, and they've really come into their own as songwriters and as performers. They know what they're doing. They know how to construct a song. They know the sound that they're going for and how to present it in a way that is just infatuating to the listener, to the dedicated listener. Let's be clear. Now, there's several great tracks on this record, and I think that one thing I have to point out is that this record, you have iconic Ween tracks. Tracks that I, when I think of Ween, I immediately think of The Going Gets Tough from the Get-Go. I immediately think of Big Jim. I immediately think of Don't Get Too Close to My Fantasy, Touch My Tutor. There's several other tracks on this record. And in here, what I would say Pure Guava has over the Potter GodWeSatan, its predecessors, is that the strong tracks here are incredibly strong, but the tracks that aren't the strongest tracks are still very strong.
Yeah, they still carry the album along.
There's only one or two tracks in here that I personally just am kind of meh on, and I still think that this is a great straight-through album listen. I wouldn't change this record. I think it's damn near perfect. 1994 rolls around, and it's time for Ween's fourth studio album, Chocolate and Cheese. Chocolate and Cheese is the biggest sonic shift between albums, from Pure Guava to Chocolate and Cheese. And it doesn't. You would think that this is when they made their major label debut, because the band jumped from the duo of Dean and Gene Ween to now being a 4-piece band. Their producer and bassist who produced all of Chocolate and Cheese. They just spent a lot more emphasis and time on the production. This is a much cleaner, fuller sound. It's much more varied in its presentation. It sounds nothing like the first 3 Ween albums, which were all in varying degrees of dirty and claustrophobic sounding, and just as minimally lo-fi production as you could get. This is much more hi-fi production. I think that they just spent so much more emphasis on this. The album opens up with just one of the best Ween tracks with "Take Me Away."
Take me away to some other land. Thank you. I gotta get away from that girl before I go crazy.
You have just the strummed electric guitar, the moving drums, and then Ween comes in with just these huge vocals that just are rocking the hell out. And get the little claps. Thank you, and then
Thank you.
and it's just perfect. It sets the tone for this entire record. It's very upbeat. It's very rocking, but you also are hearing a much more professional, full sounding version of Ween.
And that's where, as you go through this album, I can't imagine listening to it for the first time in 1994 if I was a hardcore fan of their first 3 albums, because I'd be like, what are these guys doing?
Oh, it would probably feel like they sold out.
Right, a little bit. But by the time you get to the end, you realize it's really not the case. It's just that now they have a bit more of a budget, they have a full band, and it opens the world to them. They can do so much more. They're not restricted to this drum machine. They do a lot more with the production. And tracks like Roses Are Free, which is much more psychedelic. There's a lot more bells and whistles to it, almost literally, in the actual sound palette. But you still get a lot of genre hopping on here. This album is a buffet.
It's a total compilation.
Yeah, it's all over the place. And you do get some tracks that I feel like tie in with their old stuff a little better. Like I Can't Put My Finger on It, the kind of noisy sludginess. Sounds like something that might have fit on Pure Guava.
Yeah, even
Same
Spinal
with,
Meningitis or HIV, the
Or
HIV
Candy.
song, Candy for sure. A little bit more on the brown side of things.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah, a little bit browner. But then, songs like Joppa Road, which is a little bit sweeter, a little bit more upbeat. What Diener Was Talking About, which is a more straightforward kind of 90s indie rock sounding track.
Voodoo Lady.
Oh my gosh.
Voodoo Lady is probably one of the catchiest tracks featured in the movie Road Trip, and I think Dude, Where's My Car? So it's kind of that it's kind of unfortunately got associated with a very bro-y movies,
Yeah.
But it's probably one of their more straightforward songs, but it has just the rhythms that you hear in that song, the drum hits in that song, and the guitar clashes just are so catchy. It's just a fun song to listen to.
Doing that stuff that you do. Messing me up with your voodoo. You drive me crazy with that boogie, oogie, 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 oogie. You drive me crazy with that boogie, boogie, boogie.
And I think that what makes Chocolate and Cheese special is that it really does offer something for everyone. And if you're open-minded enough, every single track is going to offer something for you.
Yeah.
And I think that that's why this album, of any album, is my favorite Ween record. And I want to give... Tom, I want you to give me some credit, because they're in a subsequent album, which we'll talk about in a bit, there's a bit more of a conceptful sounding record to it, but this is a full out compilation, and it's my favorite Ween record.
Yeah, which is interesting, but I think the reason it works that way is because, which you can kind of say about Ween's whole discography, but these songs don't repeat each other. That is so important in a good album, and while this is kind of a compilation feel, it's a compilation where the songs still lean on each other. And I think the reason for that, and this is my number 3 favorite Ween album, and it was interesting when I was putting together, I put together a list of some of my favorite Ween songs, and I came to this album, and this album was actually the album I pulled the fewest tracks from.
Ooh.
Which is weird, I know.
I don't think I could agree with you there, buddy.
But it's because, to me, these songs, despite it feeling like a compilation, exist to serve the album still.
Now that I agree.
Right.
That I agree, because of any of the records, I feel like this one, though there's a couple that I feel this way about, but I feel like you can really, I never want to skip a track on this record.
Yeah.
Ever. I want to put it on and listen to it straight through. And I do think that the tracks, and I got to give them credit, because there has to be some sort of design here in the track listing, because you have all these different sounding tracks, these tracks that take on different subject matters, different genres, different moods, different keys, different instrument palettes.
Yeah.
They're entirely different compositions, but yet they flow somehow. So there is some sort of design going on here, and I haven't cracked that nut yet, but don't worry, I'm going to keep listening to Chocolate and Cheese to see if I can do it over the time. I have many of my favorite Ween tracks come from this record. The first 3 tracks, Take Me Away, Spinal Meningitis, Freedom of 76, are some of my favorite Ween songs. Roses Are Free, Drifter in the Dark, Baby Bitch, Voodoo Lady, the HIV song. But I actually think one of the highlights of this entire album, which is the longest track on the album, an over 7-minute track. It's a kind of a Spanish story of it's called Buenas Tardes Amigo, and it's a story. I don't know how else to describe it, but the song just tells the story about how this guy killed this other guy's brother, and he goes about how he's going to seek revenge and kill this guy, but then it turns out in the end that it was him.
Spoiler alert.
Boom. Yeah, I know I ruined it for everybody. But
right. But it's an enthralling story, and it's told well.
It's told well, it's performed well, and it shows a new side of Ween that we haven't really seen yet, where they're getting into these characters, developing the characters and kind of just trying to view a whole scene from a different perspective, but it also sheds light on the band, who these guys are and why they write music. And I think that's what makes this album so special.
Buenos tardes, amigo. Hola, my good friend.
We're moving on to 1996, where for whatever reason, the guys in Ween get a bug up their ass to go to Nashville and record a country album, 12 Golden Country Greats, which they recorded in Nashville. It's their first album not to be produced by Andrew Weiss, their longtime producer and collaborator. There'll only be one other album that's not produced by him. But it's a country album. There's nothing better to introduce it than that. They get the Shit Creek Boys, which is actually just kind of the moniker they gave this group of
12 different musicians,
right,
country musicians that in typical Nashville fashion, Ween doesn't actually play any instruments on this album. They only provide vocals. So the Shit Creek Boys, the 12 of them provide various different instrumentation throughout the course of recording these records, and they switch out different instrumentalists during each of these songs. Now, they had dabbled with a country song on Chocolate and Cheese with the song Drifter in the Dark.
Yeah.
And several other records later on in their discography also dabble in country. Country is not a genre these guys are scared of. But really, Ween, one thing I love and I find endearing about this band, they're not scared to do anything.
No.
And they actually do have an aptitude to write really catchy country music. And I'm not a country, I do not claim to be a country expert or a country fan in the least, because so much of country music just isn't done in a way that I particularly like. It doesn't trip my trigger, if you'll excuse my cliche. But I do find that 12 Golden Country Greats, the 10 songs on this record, 12 Golden Country Greats, the 10 songs on this record, I find most of them to be pretty engaging, to be pretty well written.
Yeah, it's still a good album. I don't think it's one of their stronger ones. It's kind of a sidestep. It's kind of a tangential move in their career.
It's kind of hard to consider it an actual Ween release as well, because it's so different, and they're not providing any of the instrumentation.
Right, and it's the one moment where you feel like they really do delve more into parody or joking, because there's no other way to put it. I mean, they just decided to release a country album, which is not a genre you'd think they would highlight for an entire album. But yeah, the writing is still good. I think the vocal performances are still good. They don't sound quite like authentic country. They still sound like Ween doing country, but that's kind of the way you want it to be. Now, I agree with you, Jake. I actually think that this album gets kind of a bad rep because there's a lot to offer here. I do think that there are some tracks that are weaker. I actually think it opens with two of the weakest tracks. I'm Holding You and Japanese Cowboy. I'm not huge on. But highlights for me, you have two tracks that are more vulgar and a little more typical Ween in spirit, which are Piss Up a Rope and Mr. Richard Smoker.
Yeah, which are the two highlights for me.
Absolutely.
And I'm no dope, but I can't cope. So hit the fucking road and piss up a rope. You can pass up a rope and you can
But then two a little more serious tracks. First off, You Were the Fool, track 9. That song is gorgeous. I think that's a great, just actually serious country track, and they pull it off real well.
Think about it, turn around and go back to the quiet sound of Jim and Dan prancing around the pool. You were the fool, and I feel sorry for you.
I love the closing track, Fluffy. The story about the dog with the kind of down-tuned vocals, but it still sounds very sincere, very authentic.
Yeah. I'll give you that. I mean, it's not one of my favorite tracks.
You're not big on that one?
I'm not the biggest on that track, but I'll give you that. It's interesting.
I like that one. The other track that I really like from this album is track 5, Pretty Girl. It's campy as hell.
It's very campy. In a lot of the tracks on this record, it's borderline on campy.
But for me, this is one of those albums where, there aren't tracks I'm necessarily going to skip. I don't hate anything on here, but those are the 5 tracks I like quite a bit. And then like Powder Blue, and I Don't Want to Leave You on the Farm doesn't do a whole lot for me. And Help Me Scrape the Mucus Off My Brain is all right. That's a Diener sang. That one and Piss Up a Rope are the two that Diener sings on the album. And he does a fine vocal job, but I just don't think Help Me Scrape the Mucus Off My Brain is a highlight.
1997 rolls around, and Ween released their most epic album in their discography, The Mollusk. The Mollusk is a loose concept album about the mollusk. There's several tracks here that reference the mollusk, including track 2, the title track. But this overall, I think, is more a connection of Ween songs that have similar production motifs that are used. Kind of giving this a not claustrophobic like the pod claustrophobic, but claustrophobic in a way of like you're underwater,
like microcosmic.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. There's a nautical theme to this record. And it's hard to describe because you kind of just experience it and like it when you hear it, but everything sounds like it has something to do with the sea.
Yeah, which is amazing because if you heard the tracks on their own, some of them wouldn't actually follow that. But because of the track order that they put and because of the production style you spoke of, Jake, even the songs that really explicitly have nothing to do with nautical themes, they just work. I think part of that, too, is I'm going to geek out again here, and I'm going to say part of it's the time signatures.
Yeah.
You have a lot of tracks on here that are in that kind of waltzing 3/4 feel, which is typical of sea shanties. In fact, track 6, The Blarney Stone, which is very much a sea shanty type song, that's in 3. The title track, The Mollusk, is the following track, Polka Dot Tail, which Polka Dot Tail really wouldn't fit at all if it wasn't for, they mention, have you ever seen a whale with a polka dot tail? Yeah. Like, that's really the only mention of anything sea-related in that song, but that's all it needs. That and the fact that it's in 3/4 and continues that kind of vibe.
And man, that song has just a great guitar solo.
Oh, great guitar solo. There's a lot of great guitar work on here, and I think that this is probably their best production accomplishment to date.
All
so
around.
So much detail.
All around. This is, I mean, like if you were to tell me that this is your favorite Ween album, I could not argue with you.
No.
And I'm going to make an argument that this is the best Ween album. It really is. In every single aspect, in the production, in the instrumentation, in the composition, in the songwriting, everything about this record is Ween at their very best.
Yeah.
This is, they put so much effort into making this a perfect record that I really do think that it is perfect. Now, is it my favorite Ween record? No, it's not, because I am just attached to Chocolate and Cheese for personal reasons, one being that Dream and Spinal Meningitis. But that's really the Ween album that I fell in love with first. The Mollusk, though, proves out that Ween is one of those bands unlike any other bands. This is the album to me that cements them, that makes me think that they deserve to be in that legendary status of bands. Just with the level of professionality that these songs achieve, yet at the same time not sacrificing Ween's just innate playfulness. One of my favorite tracks, in fact, my favorite track on this record, one of my top 5 favorite Ween tracks, is track 11 on The Mollusk, Waving My Dick in the Wind. And actually, I think that this has just really become my life soundtrack, just waving my dick in the wind. If it all goes all right, I'll be in your arms tonight. I'm waving my dick in the wind. And then he goes, I'm lost in the sauce once again. It goes on and on. And then it goes into this whole other, like, the song just kind of spins out of control. And then it's talking about, have you seen old Jimmy Wilson dance? And then it's like, dance, Jimmy. And he goes, I can't dance. It just tells a story within this song that's just nonsensical at the same time. And it just makes you laugh. And yet at the same time, it's really fun to listen to. It shows how far Ween has come since their early days. I think that one song really proves out how much Ween has grown as artists. And
I think that really what proves as a testament to how good of a crafted album this is the fact that, like I said, the songs that don't even explicitly serve the theme somehow still fit. You have tracks 9 through 12, Cold Blows the Wind, Pink Eye on My Leg, Waving My Dick in the Wind, and Buckingham Green, which have nothing to do with the nautical theme. But those 4 tracks are sandwiched between the Golden Eel and Ocean Man, which obviously are,
right.
And somehow they all still feel like they fit. You have Mutilated Lips, track 5, which is a highlight for me. I love that song. One of the more psychedelic and trippy songs on the album. And there's really no mention there of anything nautical, but you have the one word tentacles in there that kind of conveys an image of maybe like an octopus or some kind of sea creature. And you have that downward reverse sweeping reverb that's used on the vocals. And you have that kind of washy wave sound in there.
Everything is a turning round. Mutilated lips give a kiss on the wrist of the worm-like tips of tentacles expanding.
So they're doing so many of these subtle, almost subliminal things to tie the album together. That's exactly what just master musicians do. That's what you do when you're crafting an immaculate album. And I think that's really what they did on this one. This is a perfect cross-section of tremendous albumization and strong individual songwriting. It's just got it all.
I would argue this is one of the better records I've ever heard.
Yeah.
Just period. And another thing that I love is that they oscillate the intensity of their work here more so than I think that they have on any other record. They really just let go and rock the hell out on a couple of tracks here. Buckingham Green probably being the one that comes first to mind, but also the Golden Eel. They also have a couple of just incredibly endearing, almost heart-wrenching ballads. One being It's Gonna Be All Right, I think is one of the most well-done Ween songs in the harmonized vocals and just some of the melodies that you hear. The lyrics are especially wrenching.
It's gonna be all.
But then also Cold Blows the Wind, which I'm pretty sure, I'm not positive. We need to fact check this. I think it's a cover.
Oh, really?
But it's just an incredibly well done song. Just in its presentation, it's a kind of a love tragedy song that really it's just incredibly evocative and shows a different side of Ween, and that's part of what I love about this record is you're really seeing a darker underbelly to Ween's music come out in the Mollusk. They still have that playfulness. There's more of a feeling of rocking out anger on some of these tracks, but also just this darkness that's here, and really you're starting to see that like aura of depression come out in some of the music here, and this is a much more serious Ween album.
Now, for anyone listening who maybe hasn't listened to Ween, hasn't really dived into their discography, I would recommend the Mollusk or Chocolate and Cheese as a starting point. I think that those are two great starting points. Mollusk is the album that made me fall in love with Ween. I actually stumbled, Jake, upon my favorite albums list that I made in 2007, like right when I'd graduated from high school, and the Mollusk was on there. And just kind of goes to show, like, this is a good entry point for the band if you haven't listened to them, because it's got a little bit of everything. All right, we move to 3 years later. In years, the longest gap between any two Ween albums that we've seen so far, from the Mollusk in 97 to White Pepper in 2000. White Pepper, 12 tracks, a little more condensed, the poppiest Ween album that they'd put out to this point, and the title kind of implies that in that it's kind of a double Beatles reference. White Album, Sgt. Pepper. They're kind
I hate to say this, but I never got that before.
Really?
I'm very ashamed. Right now.
Yeah,
You just connected dots for me, Tom.
that's it. Because they decided they were gonna go for more of a Beatles-esque kind of
That makes perfect
pop
sense.
rock sound, and
Yeah.
with a lot of the instrumentation you hear on here, you hear that. Track 7, Back to Basem, in the second half of the verse, I love when that kind of key part comes in. It sounds a lot like the mellotron at the beginning of Strawberry Fields Forever. Little touches like that. Now, this is also the second and last album not to be produced by Andrew Weiss, their longtime friend and collaborator. And I think that once again, it's because like they were making something very polished. Now, still, I would always have trouble saying that Ween ever came close to selling out. I don't think that they do here. I think this is as close as they get to making something commercially relatable and accessible, but still, like, you never feel like they're doing it for the sake of popularity. There's just talented songwriters, and they wanted to see if they could make an album in this kind of genre, and I still think they succeed at it.
All right, Tom. So I need to tell you a bit of a story about how albumization and track listing became so important to me, because this is the album that taught me the importance of track listing. Back in the days when we may or may not have purchased albums and may have downloaded them on sites like iMesh or Napster, or,
Good legalese
Kazaa.
there, Jake.
Yeah, absolutely. Back in those days when you would just get a copy of a CD from somebody, sometimes you would get albums and tracks wouldn't be in the right order, or you'd just have albums that were missing tracks. White Pepper was one of those albums for me. The tracks were in the wrong order. In fact, when I first fell in love with White Pepper, on the burned disc that I have, Even If You Don't was the starting track, and then it it flowed into exactly where I'm at, which is the proper opening track, and then Flew to the Tree, and then Bananas and Blow. By the way, if you've ever listened to White Pepper, you'll probably agree with me that those 4 songs are probably the strongest songs on the record.
Oh, this
or at least,
album opens tremendously.
Yeah,
that first stretch is
yeah, if
just
I
great.
had one criticism of White Pepper, it's that it is enormously front heavy. Just in the quality of the tracks. The first 4 tracks on this album are some of Ween's best work. And anyway, so what I kind of learned from that is when I later on realized that something had gone horribly wrong in the world of music, and in the track listing of this really good album had been misplaced or displaced. And then I got the track listing right and listened to it again. I found that I didn't like the album quite as much. It's still to this day, and that was like 10 years ago. So like still to this day, I still prefer that original way that I had the track listing. And maybe part of that is just relativity. I fell in love with it that way, and so therefore I think that is the proper way. But I'd like to think that I actually have discovered something, that the flow of the album means something, and that the way that you can configure tracks actually enhances or can take away from the experience. So in theory, there is an optimal way that you can list out tracks on an album. White Pepper taught me that lesson. Now, I'm not saying that that's a criticism of White Pepper, because the first 4 tracks in this album, regardless of the order that you put them in, are fantastic. And I think that's what I really want you guys to take away from this, is when you listen to the songs Exactly Where I'm At, which, Tom, do you like that song?
That is my favorite Ween song.
That's it.
I love it.
I think it's a worthy... It's
a
very
terrific
Beatle-esque song.
It is. I just like everything about it sounds so full, and there's that guitar riff. It's so simple. It just oscillates between 2 notes and then a little bendy. And it just sounds great. Like that,
did the bendy thing.
Did a little bendy. But it's tremendous to me. I freaking love that song.
One of the just all-time classic Ween tracks is "Flutes of the Chi." It has a very kind of White Album, Beatles era sort of like kind of Eastern vibe to it. Yet it's just something just happy and optimistic about that track.
Everything that you are, that you'd like to be, will come in 3, my friend.
Bananas and Blow. What more do you need to know? It's a song.
That steel drum, man. That steel drum is great.
The steel drum is great. Bananas and Blow, the vocal chorus that you hear in there is just fantastic, catchy, uplifting, and kind of sardonic at the same time in typical Ween fashion. Everything that you've come to love about Ween.
Bananas and blow. Bananas and blow. Bananas and blow. Stuck in my Quebec, living on bananas and blow.
Then you're just taking, like, those first 4 songs are just so masterful and kind of subdued at times.
Yeah.
And then it goes into track 5, Stroker Ace, which is just an
hard rock
with an edge of punk. Just
I really like that song.
Lots of just guitar shredding in it. It's just they just go all out. So just the juxtaposition between just like the soft kind of Beatlesque melancholy that you hear, and just then the all out guitar onslaught of Stroker Ace, I think is funny. And then you go into Ice Castles and some of the other tracks on the album. Now, the back half of this record, I think meanders a bit more, gets a bit more experimental, not quite as focused, but also not quite as rambunctious as like earlier Ween. They're trying to be more serious on White Pepper.
They definitely are. And then, like, Pandy Fackler, to its credit, is a great riff on Steely Dan.
Yeah.
Sounds a lot like Steely Dan. But for Ween, I don't think it's one of Ween's better songs. I also think the last 2 tracks, Falling Out and She's Your Baby, they're okay. I don't think Ween ever made just like a terrible, unlistenable track, at least to me. Probably a lot of people find a lot of their stuff unlistenable, but to their
like
credit.
Flies on My Dick?
Right. I love that song. That's
or
like
Reggae Junkie Jew?
Hey, this is 2 of my favorites, man.
I know, me too.
But
except Reggae Junkie. I'm coming around.
Yeah,
I'm
coming around.
Tom.
Okay, we'll see. We'll see if you get there. But I do want to call out track 10 on White Pepper, "Stay Forever," which is just one of my favorite love songs. Period. And I love that they can do something like that and not betray their entire attitude and their entire fan base. Like, you listen to that song and you're like, wow, this is the same guys who did "Flies on My Dick" and Dr. Rock. They do this beautiful love song, but it works. It's performed well. It's performed very tactfully. It's just got really sharp instrumentation, and that's really what White Pepper is all about. I think that it's an album that, to me, it's hard to really love throughout because, Jake, as you mentioned, the back half is a little bit weaker, but it's one that I certainly come back to for select tracks, and it still doesn't disappoint.
Whereas many of the Ween albums, I would classify as like fantastic. The previous 3 that we talked about, Pure Guava, Chocolate and Cheese, The Mollusk, Tom, those are each of our top 3 favorite Ween albums in different orders, obviously. Those 3 albums, I think, are masterpieces, whereas this is just a good album. Okay, in 2003, Ween released one of the records which I would consider kind of an enigma.
Yeah.
Quebec. This was a record that in all of Ween's presentation so far, and I think you hear it start to go a bit darker in the Mollusk and a bit darker, but still trying to, like, almost at the risk of sounding forced at times on White Pepper, some upbeat optimism. There's still undercurrents of melancholy and maybe even depression. Quebec, on Quebec, you hear that Ween really kind of embrace a darker sound.
Yeah.
And there's reasons for that. First of all, Gene Ween, Aaron Freeman, the half of the Ween brainchild, he was starting to go through a rough time with his marriage. The marriage was starting to fall apart. And, I think he's gone on record saying that, like, he never comes back and listens to this record because it's too personal from him. And I think that there was a lot of things going on in his mind from a personal perspective. And you you just look at the track listing on Quebec, and I think that you can get the sense of that. This album opens with a song called "It's Gonna Be a Long Night."
Yeah.
I mean, they're kind of prepping you for the fact that this is gonna be
like
a ride.
Motorhead song.
It goes into Zoloft. And if you listen to that song, it sounds like it has this like psychedelic but yet playful poppy feel to it. It's almost like pretend.
They do such a good job of making that fake happy.
Like
exactly
right.
What you would expect from the lyrical content. And oh my God, the line "Make me love me." Oh my God, like it's dark as hell when you really think about it.
But it's super upbeat
right,
sounding.
Right.
to the point that it sounds fake. It's just such a strange amalgamation of what they're doing. It's just a very interesting songwriting approach. It's obviously not something that hasn't been done before, but still just done very well by Ween.
Give me that Z.
Other track titles that kind of stick out to me: Happy Colored Marbles.
Yeah,
and
follows a similar theme.
Yep, and then later on, the last track on the record, If You Could Save Yourself, You'd Save Us All. So just in the track titles, I think you're starting to hear more of a introspective, kind of darker tone to it.
There's desperation there. They're having a lot more trouble hiding behind the humor. And Gene Ween is really just letting his soul come out on these tracks. You have like track 9, Captain, which is just this really like ambient kind of drifting track. Captain, Turn Around and Take Me Home is like pretty much the only lyric in the song. Like it's chilling, really. I Don't Want It, which is just a very heartfelt confessional, just exposing one's feelings, you know. But then you still have that mixed in with some songs that feel kind of goofy, like the Fucked Jam, which is just kind of a silly noise over this driving jam. This album I find to be extremely strong. On its own, I mean, these songs are damned good. In particular, I would say like the first 6 tracks or so are just damn near perfect. Some highlights for me from there, well, freaking all of them. They're all good. So Many People in the Neighborhood is another good dark turning point.
Almost sounds like Primus a bit on that song.
And it gets heavy and sludgy in the middle and kind of bass driven.
The track after that, Tried and True, just
great
the crazy acoustic
part.
Guitars that you hear in that song. It has just kind of this anthemic feel to it that it just kind of hits you right in the feels, you know.
Oh, that it's cool for you to love me now. I put everything cause tried and true. I see the light in you.
There's 2 things that bring this album down a little bit for me compared to other Ween albums, which I freaking love this band. I mean, I think that Quebec is an achievement. If it was any other band, it'd probably be their best album. It's not one of my more favorites, but I still love this album. But what brings it down for me just a little bit is the last few tracks. I don't get as much into the way this album ends. I actually think the closing track, If You Could Save Yourself, You'd Save Us All, is pretty powerful. But the 2 tracks before it, Alkin Road and The Argus, aren't quite highlights for me, and they're 2 of the longest tracks on the album.
I don't know if I can go with you here, buddy.
Really?
I love
those tracks?
I love the last 3 tracks. And
all right.
You know, I do think that this album kind of sags in the middle. I would agree with you. I think tracks 1 through 6 are extremely strong, and I think it like tracks starting with Happy Colored Marbles, you know, Hey There Fancy Pants. Hey There Fancy Pants is just kind of like it would kind of fit back on like Chocolate and Cheese.
Or even their country album.
Yeah,
almost.
honestly, that's true. There's just a couple songs in there I just don't feel like carry the same sort of emotional weight that the rest of the album seems to have a theme of. But then once you have the Fuck Jam, and then it kind of that song literally has like 5-second breaks in it that break up the record and the sound, and then it goes into the last 3 tracks, which are very, very serious, which is the essence of what Quebec is. Quebec is not a fun record. This is not supposed to be a record that you laugh at. This is supposed to be a record that makes you go, holy shit, these guys are going through some stuff.
Yeah.
And like it's supposed to get in your soul. It's supposed to make you feel things that you may not necessarily want to feel. Whereas that's totally different than almost every other Ween record you've heard thus far.
Yeah. And what's odd that brings me back to this album is the darkness of it, which is something you don't get from other albums. And I think that's representative of the collective of all the songs. But the other thing that brings this album down just a little bit for me is that on a track-by-track basis, I feel like you get some of these sounds on other albums more so than you can say. Like, it feels more similar in some of the styles than other stuff. I mean,
I would say that this album doesn't have like a sonic identity outside of its own depression.
Right. way better summed up what I was probably going to spend like 10 minutes rambling about. So we'll just leave it at that. I think it struggles with its own identity in terms of style. I think this is the first time in their career that they stepped on their own toes just a little bit, but the songwriting is so damn good that it's hardly a criticism. I think that it's still just a tremendous album, but probably not in my very top tier.
Yeah, this one was kind of surprised for me because, to be honest, I had not listened to this. I'd listened to it maybe like once or twice before getting ready for the concert, Tom, and then preparing for this review, and then just listening to this, discovering all of these gems that I had just previously cast aside for some reason. I feel super foolish for not giving this album the proper amount of time and listens, because now I can't stop listening to this record. I really enjoy this record. It definitely deserves to be considered as one of the best in Ween's catalog.
Following Quebec, and as we mentioned, Gene Ween was going through kind of a rough time. He went through a divorce. He then went to rehab. Things were looking a little bit rough. But then the two got back together. They worked a bit. They released Shinola Volume 1 in 2005, which is a compilation album of some singles and odds and ends stuff from across their discography.
Wait, does that imply that Volume 2 is going to come out someday?
They've said that maybe they will someday, but there aren't any promises. There is actually no expectation that they will. And, Shinola, it's not really a real studio album since it's a compilation. Kind of more of a B-sides and unreleased material album.
It doesn't sound like an album either when you play it.
No, it doesn't. But there are some good tracks on it. In particular, I don't know, I really like the Michael McDonald-esque Boys Club. That's a fun track.
Boys Club. Boys Club. Boys Club. Take the time, have some fun. Go outside, make love in the sun. Boys Club.
Big Fat Fuck is kind of a fun one.
Yeah, that's a Ween song.
Monique the Freak near the end of the album. We got to see them play that one live.
Yep.
That's the one that they haven't played too much, and that was really good. Kind of more of a Prince-infused kind of funky track. But then the year after that is actually when I saw them live in Des Moines, so that was pretty cool. And then in October of 2007, they put out what is now their most recent studio album, La Cucaracha. La Cucaracha it's interesting. You still see them playing around with a lot of different genres. You see them kind of bring back the country romp with Learnin' to Love. You see them do kind of an early kind of almost sounds like emo-ish type song with Shame Maker. And just a lot more of the fun lyrics that you didn't quite get on Quebec due to the personal strife that the band was going through.
I feel like if Quebec was them really embracing the darker undertones and kind of like the what the band was going through at the time, or particularly Gene was going through at the time, La Cucaracha is them kicking against that as hard as they can.
Right.
Trying to get back to just the basics. What is Ween? Ween is fun. And Ween is obnoxious debauchery. And but yet doing that with a full studio budget and let's be frank, simpler songwriting. This album, at least the first 10 tracks of this record are more simple, just more straightforward songs. I mean, probably the closest thing that these guys have done to true pop music. You have a lot more simple song structures here.
Yeah.
You're seeing more of the verse chorus format. Not as lush mixes. There's just less tracks that you're hearing come out of the speakers on this record. And just I gotta say some of the lyrical motifs that you hear are repeated over and over again. Through in that particular track, you'll hear the certain song, they'll repeat the same melody over and over again. There's just a lot of repetition here. There's a lot more simple production, and I don't know exactly how to say it other than that's not what Ween is to me.
Yeah,
that's not what Ween is to me. And I gotta be honest, as I've gone through and feel like I have a really decent understanding of all of Ween's records now, this has become my least favorite Ween record, Tom. Yeah. It really has. And I still think it's good. Don't get me wrong. I still think this is a pretty good record. I still think, like, if you compare this to any of the albums that have come out in, like, so far in 2016, that I'd rank this probably in, like, the low 80s.
Yeah.
I think it's a solid record. You have a lot of songs that are really fun. Highlights for me, Blue Balloon, track 2. Just kind of a solid song, has an interesting rhythm, some great synthesizers in the song, just catchy melodies. It's still Ween still has that spark that they can write really catchy melodies like that.
As she bounces through the blue sky, everybody's building up a big blue balloon.
There's other songs, Learning to Love, the country song that Tom mentioned. I've always kind of found to be very obnoxious.
So true story. Since this album came out, I will randomly text Jake doop doop doobalep just to get this song stuck in his head and annoy him, and it's great
because Ween made this song so it gets stuck in your head, and it's the most obnoxious thing. But where they were obnoxious before, when they were more juvenile, it was obnoxious in a really kind of cleverly funny way. This is just obnoxious to be obnoxious. This is just this is like just. I forget what it was. Have you heard what an air horn sounds like? Just like doing that like just making noise to make noise. It's just stupid.
But the harmonies are great.
Oh my god! and
I honestly do like that song. But
yeah. Yeah,
but
I know you do.
I know I like this album more than you, and I like it a lot more than most Ween fans. Jake, I think that you are very indicative of what the kind of the general response to this album was.
Okay, well, that makes me feel a little better.
A lot of people were lukewarm to this. A lot of people considered this to be one of, if not the worst Ween album. And I actually kind of disagree with that, but that's also due to how I listen to it and my history with it. For me, what drives this album is it's got a handful of my all-time favorite Ween songs. Blue Balloon, Friends, With My Own Bare Hands, which
is a fantastic song.
Some of the best Ween lyrics out there.
I gotta point out with that song, the guitar in that is just so visceral and crunchy and just thick sounding. I love the sound of that guitar. In Dean Ween's guitar part in that song, and I gotta say though that the lyrics, while I find the lyrics funny, they're obnoxious. They're trying to sound juvenile to the point that it's not even funny how juvenile they sound. You know.
She's gonna be my cock professor, studying my dick. She's gonna get a master's degree in fucking me. I can do so many things.
It's kind of that fart joke that you either like or you don't.
Like, I love fart jokes, don't get me wrong, but this is like, hey, I farted 20 times. Do you still think my farts are funny?
Guess what? I do.
That's why I love you, Tom Hummer.
But the other one I really love is the closing track, Your Party.
Yes.
With that sultry saxophone.
Your Party is so sardonic.
And Gene Ween's super smooth vocals. Just, like, it's great. So this
is...
The
wife and I, thank you very much.
Yes.
We had the best time at your party. The wife and I thank you very much.
This is definitely an album of individual tracks. They don't all come together all that well. And really, like, by all means, when you compare it to, like, Quebec, their previous studio album, I mean, I think Quebec is hands down a stronger album all around. I think that the songwriting is stronger. For whatever reason, I find myself coming back to Le Cucaracha more frequently just because, for me,
it's fun.
It's and it's a little more...
It's lighthearted.
It's a little more straight through. I mentioned there were a few
This is very
tracks,
superficial, honestly.
Yeah.
Like, it's just a more superficial... If all of Ween's albums take kind of an effort to really get something out of it because it's so multifaceted.
Yeah.
This album really isn't. It's pretty straightforward up until the last couple of tracks. I want to point out track 11, Lullaby. It's 3 minutes and 20 seconds of piano ballad.
Sleeping like a baby, first day all in line, and fair.
And I think it is one of the most moving, emotional Ween songs.
Yeah.
Period.
It's a great song.
It just like I listen to that and I want like it makes me want to cry. Like it's just a beautiful song, and Gene Ween's vocals in that just just are so evocative, and he still hasn't. It's just like you hear despair but hope, and it's just a great song. And then it goes into the almost 11-minute prog rock epic of Women and Men, which I find a little obnoxious just in the length, but I also appreciate because like they had the balls to do that. They
It's
had
like a Kansas song.
They really haven't done that, and so like I'm glad that they like got that notch in their belt. And then it ends with Your Party, which is one of my favorite Ween songs as well. I also played that live, and it was fantastic.
Yeah, it was great. Yeah, I thank them very much for playing that one. But yeah, I have a hard time arguing La Cucaracha is one of their better albums. But I do think, and a lot of people would disagree with me on this, I do think it's pretty solid in quality. Now, I even love tracks like The Fruit Man and Spirit Walker and Shame Maker. Like those stick with me. I love in Spirit Walker how it's just got this like auto-tune on it that does not work. To me, as a music producer, that's kind of a fun parody on what autotune was doing at the time.
They're almost commenting on how shitty autotune is.
Right.
And how terrible it sounds on almost every artist.
Right. And so I do love that aspect of it. But at the same time, when you look at what they had accomplished with their previous albums and how they had pushed the envelope forward, not only for themselves, but for music in general, La Cucaracha simply doesn't accomplish that. And that's undeniable. But still, it's a good record from a great band.
So, Tom, where does Ween go from here? Well, like, it's 2007.
Hopefully they keep doing shows.
It's 2007. What happened after that?
I see. I thought you meant from 2016. So after that, unfortunately, things went a little sour. Gene and Dean Ween had kind of a fallout. They had an infamous performance in Vancouver, Canada, where Gene was just kind of out of it. Didn't really perform. It was kind of a non-performance.
Off key.
Right.
Couldn't play his instruments.
Right. And
ended up laying just down on stage, spread eagle, and the rest of the band just kind of walked off.
From there, they just kind of fell apart. I know that Dean and Gene did some stuff that really pissed each other off. One thing that we haven't really addressed is, just for the sake of time, they released several live albums, and also throughout their career, they were releasing, little one-off tapes and things for fans. They released Craters of the Sack was one that they put on that was some odds and ends, B-sides and singles and stuff. But then I know Dean posted something online without Gene's permission that Gene was very offended by some recordings that he'd released without the other's approval and things like that. And so they ended up kind of officially breaking up and disbanding at that point. But now, lo and behold, in 2016, they are back together doing shows. Jake and I mentioned that we saw them last week, which was really a great moment, Jake, because I remember a few years back when I told you that they broke up, and you were like, no!
Wasn't that like on recording too?
It was. I think we were reviewing something. It was in your basement, whatever that series of reviews we did. Like around the time we did like How It Feels to Be Something On and that kind of stuff. But like you were devastated because like you really that was a band you like had to see.
Yeah, they're on my like I have a short list of bands I have to see, and they're usually bands you also have to see. So we go see these concerts together. Right. But Ween was definitely one of those, and I'm glad I got to take them off my list.
It was great,
and I got to say, like if they came around again, I would want to go see them again.
Yeah,
not because like it's not one of the I would say that they put on a really strong concert. It wasn't one of the best concerts I've ever been to, but just the variety of the work that they played. I mean, they played Pollo Asado live. They played Laura live. I mean, it's just stuff like that. Like they just are pulling random tracks from the discography, and that's, I think, a great way to sum up Ween as a band. These guys have released, 9 studio records. If you include Shinola, 10 albums of just unique songs that they've released. And you're talking like over 100 songs that they can just pull out at any point in time, and they're all worthwhile. They're all worthwhile to listen to.
Yeah, I actually took the time to count, and of the 9 plus Shinola, I think it was like 163 tracks. And the beauty of their live performance is that everything is on the table. Like they play something from every album. I looked up the set list of the show they played the night after we saw them, Jake, and they didn't play a single song that they had played when we saw them.
Which is just crazy.
It's insane.
Because I thought the set list they played was great.
Right.
And you can play 30 other songs and they're still going to be great.
there's not a bad set list that they could play, and that's the magic of this band. So I think that really what you have when you look at their entire career is one of the most unique, bizarre, beautiful, and inspiring bands that you could ever listen to. This is a band that, if they did not exist, you would not be able to fabricate them in your mind.
No.
You would not be able to just imagine out of thin air what Ween is. They're really, like, they're a world of their own.
Yeah.
And across their entire discography, they've done something that I just think no other band has even come close to doing. It's really, I really do think that just these two goofy teenagers from Pennsylvania, I think that they came together to create something that ended up really being very special. And another testament to that is, I talk to people who maybe don't know Ween very well or just know them casually. And this might sound a little pretentious, but I'm not trying to say it from a personal standpoint of how much I like them or how everyone should know them. I'm just saying this from the standpoint of how truly diverse and good they are. They are a band that, if you've heard 4 of their 9 studio albums, you still don't see the big picture. There's not a lot of bands you could say that with. If you came up to me and said, "Oh yeah, I love Ween. I've listened to Chocolate and Cheese, Pure Guava, and White Pepper," then I'd be going, "Oh, but you haven't heard Quebec or The Pod or The Mollusk."
Yeah.
Like there's still, until you listen to everything and wrap your head around it, you're missing a piece of the puzzle, and that's a key piece.
You're totally right. And up until like 3 weeks ago, I would say that fit me. I had not listened to GodWeSatan or The Pod. I listened to The Pod like once or twice, but not like recently.
Same here. Yeah.
And so diving into those records, I had listened to Quebec once or twice, but not recently. Diving into that record, really learning what that record is. I mean, when I try to dive into a record, I really try to dig into every track and understand why that track was made and where it fits on the album and the impact it has on the whole album listening experience. So I really do feel like I get a decent understanding of that. Totally has changed my context of what Ween is as an artist, as a band. And I gotta say, like, we've been doing a lot of artist deep dives over the past year. We've been doing this podcast, Tom, and we prepare pretty thoroughly, I'd say. Like, we really listen to all of the albums that we're going to talk about ahead of time a number of times. And in the weeks that we've been probably getting ready for this for 2 to 3 weeks now.
Yeah.
In advance of the concert, and then the last like 6 days getting ready to do this podcast. And whereas most artist deep dives, I want to be done listening to that band when I'm done with it. I still haven't listened to Radiohead since we did the Radiohead deep dive.
Yeah, I haven't.
That's
either.
my favorite band. I still haven't listened to them.
Yeah.
I don't want to stop listening to Ween.
Yeah.
I still, like, I'm going to listen to Ween on my drive home tonight. Like, I still want to listen to Ween. I don't want to stop.
Yeah.
Like, I'm kind of sad that we're doing this right now because they're so impactful. There's so much content to get through, and there's so many layers to every single thing, and there's so much to offer.
And as soon as you get sick of one thing that they do, you just move on to another thing, and you don't feel like you're listening to the same band.
And you're blown away by that.
Right. Exactly.
And I think that's really what like when you get to this point that I think we're at this really special point right now, Tom, where we're realizing just how special this band is.
Yeah.
This is why they're such an avid cult following of Ween. That's why it's because, like, once you get in this like mindset and you're starting to pick everything apart and seeing the whole Ween picture, it becomes this sort of echo chamber that you can't get out of. I mean, I feel like wonderfully trapped right now. Like, I'm in my own little box and it's just this happy little world that's Ween.
Because it's like it's like you're in on it now.
Yeah.
Like, you understand.
I know
it.
the joke.
And it's like, I think that there's this kind of stigma out there that only weird stoners like Ween, and I will say we saw plenty of those at the concert. Like, let's be fair, but I think that that's a little bit misleading because, of course, while anything with a bizarre absurdity to it will appeal to that kind of crowd, I'm certainly not of that crowd, and I'm not trying to talk down on folks who smoke or choose to do what they want to do. That's fine. But I don't think that that's necessary. I just think that this is a tremendously good musical group with as diverse a catalog as you can get.
They offer something for everyone.
Right.
They really do.
And I would encourage anyone who hasn't checked them out to check them out. And, maybe start small. Maybe start with a couple of the more accessible albums if you think that's what you'd be more into. But I would definitely say give them a shot.
Top 3 favorite Ween albums, honorable mention, and then your least favorite Ween album.
Okay. Top 3 has got to be Pure Guava, then The Mollusk, then Chocolate and Cheese. From there, man, it's tough because, like, The Pod, Quebec, La Cucaracha, and White Pepper I put on close to the same level. My least favorite is probably 12 Golden Country Greats or GodWeSatan.
Okay.
Those two are kind of tied for last, I'd say, but I still really like them.
Yeah. For me, it's your top three are still my top three. It's just different order. Chocolate and Cheese and the Mollusk are I mean, the Mollusk is just like a fractional hair under Chocolate and Cheese. Those two albums are really it for me. And then Pure Guava would be underneath that. My least favorite has to be La Cucaracha, maybe GodWeSatan somewhere in there, just for the scope of that record. But I already like love so many tracks on that record that it's already kind of eclipsed La Cucaracha in my mind. Honorable mention though, I gotta say Quebec has been the big surprise for me in getting to know this discography really well. I think that album just has so much to offer, but it requires like a very detailed listen to understand kind of the deeper meaning of what's going on there. And that really does kind of sum up that Ween has something there for everyone. So, you folks out there, what's your favorite Ween album? Why? And what makes Ween so special to you? Also, make sure you check out the Ween Spotify playlist. I think it'll be called Velocities in Music, _, Ween.
Well, now that's what I'm going to call it. Yeah.
Well, yeah, now you have to because I said it.
Yep.
So that's what it's going to be called. Out there on Spotify, you should be able to subscribe to it and just listen to all of Tom and my favorite Ween tracks from
good overview of their discography.
Yeah, a good overview of this discography. I assume, Tom, a lot of the tracks you're going to sample for this podcast. As always, thank you guys for your continued support and participation with Velocities in Music. Tom and I love all of your comments on our YouTube videos, your Facebook messages, and your emails to us. Your participation is what makes Velocities in Music possible, so thank you for being awesome. I'm Jake.
I'm Tom.
We are Velocities in Music, moving music discussion forward.